First Samuel chapter 18. Alright, so 1 Samuel chapter 18. Probably jot a few notes down, but we'll talk about a few things here. Lesson 2, David behaves himself wisely, Jaden.
Did you upload it yet?
What's that? Lesson 2? It's right there. That's the one you're supposed to have done. Alright, lesson 2, David behaves himself wisely. 1 Samuel chapter 18. So we're going to start at verse 1 here. David has killed Goliath. He's been taken into the palace by Saul. And that's where this kind of starts out. Chapter 18, verse 1. And it came to pass when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. And David went out whithersoever Saul went, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets and joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. Alright, there's a few important things to take a look at here. When Saul was probably in that room talking to David, maybe hiding in the back corner behind a pillar or in a dark place, was Saul's son Jonathan. And Jonathan could overhear everything that David and Saul were talking about. And Jonathan, being one who loved the Lord, he heard the words of David, and he could tell that David too was a son of God. He loved the Lord. And we see that David in his speech to Saul therefore must have showed his great faith, his love for the Lord, and that is how the two souls that we read there became knit. Jonathan loved God, and because he loved God, he loved David. And we see how they behave then, because that Jonathan takes off his robe, his important robe as a prince, as the next in line to the throne, and his belt with all of his tools on it, his sword and bow, and he gives them to David. Jonathan already can see the Lord is working here. Jonathan knows God has used the Spirit to work in the heart of Jonathan for him to know that Jonathan will not be the next king sitting on the throne. Jonathan sees his father, the way that he behaves and the way that he acts, his sins, his wickedness, and he knows that his father probably won't last long on the throne. And that he too will not one day take up the throne, but it will be David. And so he gives that over. So we can see here, Jonathan is humble. He's meek already. Now, Saul also, we read there, does not allow him to go home. It's not because he's necessarily already jealous of David, but he wants David to stay there and work for him. He wants to keep an eye on him. Okay? Now, God has a different purpose here. Saul might want to keep him here for his own purposes, But God is using Saul to keep here so that as David, as we said, as David goes to and fro in the palace, what does he see? He sees people bringing their troubles to the king. And so he learns that a king must have to judge. He sees the inner workings, the many people who help out, that make things run. He learns what a good wise man and maybe a bad wise man are. He sees godly priests coming to and fro and probably wicked priests coming to and fro. David sees these things. God is training David here. Okay? So Saul's jealousy is used to the advantage of David in that David is receiving inadvertently, although by the providence of God, but to Saul's purposes, inadvertently teaching him all about the kingdom. Now, we see that they go out into battle. And David is put over, again, a group of the army. Again, Saul maybe putting David in the line of danger, or maybe Saul tires of having David in the kingdom because so many people are fawning over him or speaking wonderfully to him. Saul finally wants him out of there. So Saul says, well, why don't you here? I'll put you as a leader of the army. You take the men out to battle. And in that way, David is gone for weeks or maybe months at a time. And finally, well, don't have to hear anything about that David guy anymore. Okay? So again, what has God in His providence done here? He's put David in a position of leadership where the people have to honor him, where they have to look up to him. So he's in a position of leadership. Then what happens? Well, when Saul and David come back from war, the women who rejoice, first of all, because their husbands are coming back, or their sons, their grandfathers are coming back from war. They rejoice along the main road. We can imagine a parade, almost like atmosphere. When someone is a champion or a winner, sometimes parades will be thrown in their honor. And tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people line the parade route. And that's what's going on here. And usually there's music and joy and cheering. And we see that here too. And the women would sing songs praising the accomplishments of the men in battle. And we see that they would sing out, well, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And as those songs were sung, of course, Saul was not happy and is filled with that jealousy. They only gave Saul a little bit of credit. They gave too much of the credit, in Saul's estimation, to David. So Saul begins to be filled with hatred. And then we have in verse 10, we see how he begins to behave because of what God does here. Verse 10, and it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul. And he prophesied in the midst of the house, and David played with his hand, and as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand, and Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it, and David avoided it out of his presence twice. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him and made him a captain over 1,000. He went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he went out and came in before them. God here sends an evil spirit to bother Saul. When we read in the New Testament of all the times and situations where God has sent a devil to bother the heart or the mind of a certain individual, that's God in control. Even with us today, we see that. Even with us today, we may have troubles in our lives, but it all comes by the providence of God. We don't see evil spirits. We don't see devils that have to be cast out necessarily anymore. God specifically did that. But here, he sends an evil spirit to Saul so that Saul, even though he knows better, will pick up that javelin and thrust it across the room, hoping to hit David. And David steps out of the way, and that spear crashes into the wall. You can imagine the big clank that it would make, or sparks that would fly as that spear struck the rock walls. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody came in here trying to kill me, I would run, and I would run as fast as I could, and I would run as far as I could, and I would never want to see that person again. We don't see that on the part of David. In fact, we hardly ever see that at all out of him. He doesn't lose himself. He doesn't become crazy and take off and just go. But no, he stays there because we see that multiple times the spear, the javelin, is thrown at David when an evil spirit comes upon Saul and he tries to kill David. This is not just the work of Saul, but also the work of Satan. Because if Satan kills David, he cuts off the line of Christ. So, Saul fears David. He knows that David is a godly person. He knows and he sees that he behaves himself wisely. But murder, God will not allow it. So then Saul tries something else. Verses 17. Okay? Look in your Bibles at verse 17. And Saul said to David, Behold, my elder daughter Merab, her will I give thee to wife. Only be thou valiant for me, and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul said, Let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. And David said unto Saul, Who am I? And what is my life or my father's family in Israel? That I should be a son-in-law to the king. But it came to pass at the time when Merab saw his daughter should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Maholathite, to wife. Saul's not a man of his word. If you remember, this goes back to when Saul promised the person who could kill Goliath would marry his daughter. This is a promise that Saul's already made, and it seems like he's gone back on his promise. He does. He gives his firstborn daughter to somebody else. And he uses David to go out, to get him to go into battle. He tries to trick him here. He tries to fool him. I'll give you my daughter, but you have to go out to battle. David answers in a very humble way. He doesn't fall in the trap. He says, Well, who am I? In other words, my family, I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm nothing. I'm just a little guy. Even here, David shows his humility. He's not, I did kill the Goliath, and I'm the great leader, and I've killed my thousands. And no, he's humble. He says, Saul, I am from the tribe of Bethlehem. We're nothing. I'm not an important person. My family's a poor family. We have nothing. Who am I to think that I could possibly be the son-in-law of the king? That I could marry the king's daughter? So we see that there. But then, we see that Saul gives away Merab to someone else. Why? Well, he wants to use some more trickery. You see, he thinks that maybe if he can send David out into the battle, into the front lines where the fighting is hot, David will die. That's the exact same line of thinking that David does later on with Uriah. But here, David sent out into the front lines. Saul hopes for him to die. But that's not going to happen because the Lord is watching over David. The Lord is protecting David when he goes out there. So then we see that someone else, another daughter of Saul, she is smitten with David. She sees him. He's a beautiful young man, handsome, good looking. She thinks, I would love to marry him. Not a spiritually strong daughter of Saul, though. So, Saul goes to David and he says once again, I've got another daughter, Michal, she loves you. Well, David doesn't fall into the trap of Saul again. Here he doesn't say, oh, yes, I'll do that, I'll go fight the Philistines again. No, David says, no, I don't need, I'm not someone who is in a position to be the son-in-law of the king. So Saul has to use a little bit of trickery. David would like to marry Michal. But the problem is, back in those days, when someone would get married, he would have to pay a large dowry to his bride's father. So, if Amber got married, whoever she married, he would have to pay a huge sum of money to Amber's dad. That's how it would have been back then. Or given many possessions, maybe sheep, cattle, land. We don't see that anymore. That's not a tradition that we uphold or that we do anymore. But in this case, the servants go to Saul and say, David. David, Michal wants to marry you, and you could be married to her, but you got to pay a dowry. And you're kind of, and David, well, I don't have a dowry to pay. I'm poor. My family really don't have much. And so the servants, who have, of course, been instructed by Saul, say to him, well, you know how you could do it? I bet that if you went to Saul and said, hey, let's forget about the dowry, I'll just go to battle for you against the Philistines, will that be an equal trade? Saul's still getting his way here then. So David goes to Saul and tells him, I'll go to battle. I have no dowry for your daughter, Michal, but I can go to battle. I can fight the Philistines for you. And Saul makes an agreement. You bring back 200 foreskins of the Philistines, and I will give you my daughter as your bride. Okay? So David does. He goes out, he kills the Philistines, he brings back those foreskins. David here is pleased because he's been given Michal, Saul's daughter. We see in verse 28, and Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, and Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. So, we see, Michal is given to David, she loves David, but Saul is still, even though now he's relation, Saul is still afraid of David, because he knows that God is working here. Saul sees that God is working in the life of David, plus he already knows from Samuel that the kingdom will be taken away from him because of his wickedness that he had done before. So, Saul is still afraid. God is not on Saul's side. God is on David's side. We can imagine that. And that's what we asked in that last question. What do you see as a reason for Saul's fear of David? Because when one sees that God is obviously on the other side of the people, won't that strike fear in that person's heart? It's hard for maybe you or me to understand, because as God's children, we know God is on our side. But can you imagine? Can you imagine knowing being the enemy of God's people? And knowing full well that you are fighting against the will, or you're fighting against the goodness of God by trying to kill His people. You will not have the victory then. You might have a temporary victory now. But in the end, when we're all called to either heaven or hell, we're brought home when we die, on that judgment day, then those people they will be judged for their actions. So although they may have victory here on earth, we can know that.